jale. Oh, I like this song, man. Uzi jale. It's a nice little song, George. Uzi jale. A tavzale, usi tavzale. That means don't you tavzale. Keep that alert, you'll surely feel you. Usi jale, 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 jale. There's a man on the street, with no food to eat. Deep in his eyes, no Jesus inside. He's cold and alone. So cold and alone. Tavzale, usi tavzale. That means don't you tavzale. Surely be you. Usi jale, 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 jale. There are times in my life when I feel so troubled. There are times in my life when I feel troubled. Oh, I really do, man. Oh, I feel trouble. You don't have to worry. Singing, God is really good to you. Brother, sister, mama, dad, tafazale, usi jale. Brother, sister, mama, dad, tafazale, usi jale, 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 jale. Tafazale, usi jale, jale. That means don't you worry, jale. Yes, it is gonna and his love never hurts. Usi jale, 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 jale. Singing, God is really good to you. God is really good to you. God is really good to you. Brother, sister, mama, dad, tafazale, usi jale. Brother, sister, mama, dad, tafazale, usi jale, 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 jale. Tafazale, usi jale. That means don't you jale. They say flowers are good, they never smell. Usi jale, 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 jale.
British people, man. It's all in the hands of God. Don't worry, man. We're the best Jamaican accent you ever heard in your life.
Hey folks, how's it going? Good to be back here with the Reclamation Project. So today, as promised, I'm going to give part 2 of the Dark Side of Darwin. Now, we had a few messages from some people who disagreed with my last presentation, and that's fine. I love it. That creates discussion. And what I would invite people to do is go and look up the things that I'm sharing, because I'm pulling straight from Darwin's own words and from historical fact, nothing else. There's no conjecture, there's no speculation. This is all fact. So today we're going to continue on our talk about the Dark Side of Darwin. We're going to do the Dark Side of Darwin part 2. But before we do that, for those who were not here during the first one, we're going to do a little bit of a recap. So as we all know, to the Western world at least, Charles Darwin is more than a man. He's an icon. He's a prophet, if you will. And as we covered in part one of the series, Darwin's journey was very interesting. He was not only not an atheist, but he was actually a devout Christian, and he went to school to study theology. His father wanted him to be a doctor, but he flunked out of medical school. He wasn't cutting the mustard. And so, contrary to what some people believe, they believe that he was like the scientific genius who was well studied and spent, had a PhD in this or that. But he actually flunked out of medical school, and then his father sent him to theology school. And so he went to the theology school in the hopes of one day becoming a priest or pastor and preaching the word of God from the pulpit. That's what his actual goal was. But somewhere along the line, this Darwin, the father of modern evolutionary science, turned away from the Bible that he had once hoped to preach, and instead turn a path that led to some very dark consequences. So we learned that, in our first talk, that although we're taught in biology class about Darwin's earth-shattering book, The Origin of the Species, that's not the actual title. That's the sanitized version of the title, because the actual title is most often hidden from us. The actual title is not Origin of the Species. It's actually On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle of Life, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Now, I've mentioned this last time, that there's some people today that try to muddy the waters by saying, well, the meaning of the word race was different, but the way that the word race was used in the 19th century was very specific. I have here a quote that says, "The word race acquired its modern meaning in the field of physical anthropology through the scientific racism starting in the 19th century." So what it means today is what it meant then, because what it means today came from then. And just to recap, some definitions here. What is this anthropology and how is it related to scientific racism? So the word anthropology was used to represent the study of human physical attributes, and separately the evolution and development of people by famous anthropologists like the German anthropologist Ernst Haeckel and the French anthropologist Paul Broca. Now, who was Ernst Haeckel and Paul Broca? I'll give you a short recap on them as well. So Dr. Paul Broca was Broca. He founded the Anthropological Society of Paris, which linked comparative anatomy to anthropology in 1859. So what he did was he invented these instruments to measure physical differences between various human beings. And as he and his friend Alphonse Bertillon were convinced that quantitative measurements revealed individuals' character and ability. So Bertillon kind of went the route of saying, using things to identify people as potential criminals. And Broca used comparative anatomy to compare the averages of different populations or races. And Broca and other scientists practicing the anthropometric measurements believed that the skull's shape and size showed that Europeans were in fact superior. And Wikipedia adds another little detail about Broca, and I'll recap that. It says Broca's work contributed to the development of physical anthropology, advancing the science of anthrometry and craniometry, in particular, the now discredited practice of determining intelligence. He was engaged in comparative anatomy of primates and humans, and listen to this, he proposed that Negroes were an intermediate form between apes and Europeans. He saw each racial group as his own species, and he actually believed that racial mixing eventually led to sterility, kind of like when you like a mule, or like when you mix a lion and a tiger and you get a liger, that they would be sterile. But I don't know if you know this, but I'm actually biracial. I'm Black and Hispanic, and so I can tell you that ain't the case because I have 4 kids. But as I'll continue, and then you have Ernst Haeckel, the other one that I mentioned, and Ernst Haeckel was actually known as the German Darwin. He was a key figure during that first sort of Darwinian revolution, and he was very pivotal at the time when the foundations for the modern evolutionary theory were being laid. And it was actually Haeckel who he contributed something very important, and that was the genealogical trees to the Darwinian theory. So he finally gave an illustration as to how, according to Darwin, this natural selection worked. He was so critical in some of the things that he brought, that there's a lot of words that he defined that are critical to science today. He not only defended, but he developed the Darwinian theory with a passion and energy. It says here in my quotes, like no one else on the continent, yet he was influential not only in Germany, but in non-German speaking countries as well. And he created the conceptual framework within which the majority of Darwinians worldwide worked over decades. So contemporary evolutionary theory is pretty much non-existent without the notions that he coined, such as phylogeny and phylum and phylogenetic trees and ecology and things like that. Now, his racial anthropology what he intended to prove was that human origins from lower organisms, but without the intention, they say, of establishing a discriminatory racial praxis. In other words, he didn't mean to be a horrible racist pig. He just was. And so, interestingly enough, as much as Haeckel was a fan of Darwin and like Darwin's biggest cheerleader, Haeckel's theories were encouraged and admired by Darwin himself. It says here in my article that I quoted that Ernst Haeckel is without doubt a crucial figure in the growth of the Darwinian thought in the 19th century. As Robert Richards emphasized, more people at the turn of the century learned of evolutionary theory from Haeckel's pen than from any other source, including Darwin's own writings. Haeckel proceeded from the assumption that humanity consists of various human species being on various stages of the phylogenetic evolution. Some of these species were closer to a hypothetical pre-human ancestor. Did you hear that? Some of these species were closer to a hypothetical pre-human ancestor. In other words, Black people and people of color. Whereas some were more evolutionarily advanced. The division into higher and lower races is at the core of any discriminatory racism. So what does this have to do with Darwin? We covered that as well. Essentially, Darwin became a fan of this racist bottom feeder, Haeckel, and Haeckel, the racist bottom feeder, became Darwin's biggest advocate because Darwin's theory of natural selection was the perfect catalyst for the despicable scientific racism of physical anthropology that eventually led to the deaths of tens of millions of people of color across the world. And then we look at Darwin's own racism in the book Descent of Man. We looked at that extensively. one of the reasons why well-meaning people are fans of Darwin is because they've never read The Descent of Man. Um, and I'll just kind of touch on some quotes really quickly. Um, Here I have an article on Darwin's book from Richard Weikart's book on Darwin's influence on some pretty interesting movements. And it says that in 1881, towards the end of Charles Darwin's life, he wrote to a colleague that the more civilized so-called Caucasian races have beaten the Turkish hollow in the struggle for existence. Looking to the world at no very distant date, what an endless number of lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world. So this was not just some sort of offhand comment that Darwin was making unrelated to his science. What that comment reflected was a very important element of the theory of evolution, and that is that one day the beautiful, perfect, stunning pinnacle of evolutionary progress, the Caucasian white man, was going to not only conquer but destroy and eliminate altogether all of these people of color. This is what Darwin was preaching, and he articulated this in no uncertain terms in his 1871 book, The Descent of Man. And he said, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, so just decades, he thought, the civilized races of man, in other words, the beautiful, stunning pinnacle of evolutionary progress, the white Caucasian man, will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. So not only was it racism, but racial extermination was like an integral feature of Darwin's theory from the start. And, you know, one of the comments that was made last time was that, oh, here's another creationist just lying again. Prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. I dare you. Go to his books and prove me wrong. He said it, not me. You see, that's the difference. You see, when people try to defend Darwin, they try to dance around these things. Or the one thing that they love to bring up is that Darwin was a proponent of slavery, or that he slept with a black woman at some point. And it's like, so what? Those slave masters slept with their black slaves. That doesn't mean anything. And the fact that he didn't like slavery didn't have anything to do with his love for black people. It had to do with the fact that he felt like that was a savage thing to do. And in order for the beautiful, perfect, stunning pinnacle of evolutionary progress, the Caucasian white man, to keep going and progressing, he had to stop doing that. So it wasn't really about us. It was more about them. But regardless, you can't dance around his own words. He basically looked forward to the time where there were no more black people, no more Aboriginals, no more Polynesians, no more Filipinos, no more Chinese, because in his mind, those people were more closely related to apes and monkeys than they were to the beautiful, stunning, brave pinnacle of evolutionary progress, the white Caucasian man. That's what he believed. And a lot of well-meaning folks don't like that, because it makes them uncomfortable, because they're strong proponents of the theory of evolution. They say, oh, well, we've moved past that. And not so fast. Another thought from his book, The Descent of Man, is the idea that white people are more intelligent and more moral. That persists throughout the book. He says that the savages, or black people and people of color, are low morality, insufficient powers of reasoning, and weak power of self-control. Or you know those, like back in the days where they used to try to scare like white people by saying that black men were just going to ravage their women and go and rape their women because we were just sexual savages and we just couldn't control ourselves when we saw the beautiful white women. Like this is where that nonsense comes from. Darwin's theory applies the survival of the fittest to human races, suggesting that extermination of non-white races is just like a natural consequence of the white Europeans being superior and a more successful race. And on top of that, Darwin justifies violently overtaking other cultures because it had happened regularly throughout history. So it's fine. Genocide, not a big deal. And he goes on and on. And there's lots of other ideas that I covered as well. But that's kind of a recap of what we talked about. If you want a more thorough recap, go watch part 1, because I cover it more in depth, and I read these quotes line by line. But here's the bigger question. What were the results of this dark side of Charles Darwin? See, because we look at Darwin almost like he's like the atheist Santa Claus, like he's just like this old jolly man with a beard who came up with this theory, and the fish single-celled amoeba and the primordial soup, and then the fish started walking, and then that's how we look at Darwin. It's so cute, but there was a very dark side to Darwin. In the Bible, there's a passage. It's in the book of Matthew chapter 7, and it says, "By their fruits ye shall know them. By their fruits ye shall know them." So what were the fruits of Darwin's theory of evolution? Well, we've already seen how Ernst Haeckel and Paul Broca were two European anthropologists, German and French, that used Darwin's theory as a catalyst to create the science of physical anthropology to justify the scientific racism and show how people of color like myself were morally and intellectually inferior to the white European man. But it goes further. Okay. So in an article I have on a website called Facing History, it talks about something called eugenics. It says, by the late 1800s, the Industrial Revolution had changed both how and where goods were made in the United States and much of Europe. More and more people were so instead of being an agricultural society, people were coming to the cities to work in factories because of the Industrial Revolution. It says more and more people were leaving the countryside for manufacturing jobs in large urban centers where they lived and worked among strangers. As so many lives and livelihoods went through dramatic changes, many people perceive the strangers of different races, ethnicities, and classes they encountered as threats to their social status and economic well-being. Listen to this. Many white Americans blame society's ills on others, including African Americans, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Native Americans, and anyone who looked, spoke, or acted differently than people perceived to be of white Anglo-Saxon heritage. And Francis Galton, who was an English mathematician and Charles Darwin's first cousin, offered an attractive solution to those who believe that these groups that we just mentioned, Blacks, Native Americans, et cetera, pose a threat. So here's Charles Darwin. You've got this Ernst Haeckel and Paul Broca developed this scientific racism, this physical anthropology, and carried Darwin's theory further. And then Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, his own first cousin, offered a solution to these white people who were thinking that all of these coloreds were responsible for all of society's ills. Says Galton decided that natural selection does not work in human societies the way it does in nature because people interfere with the process. So what Galton was saying is, yes, natural selection, that's how it should. And in nature, nature takes its course. Everything's allowed to happen as it should. But in human society, people actually interfere with natural selection. And that's why it doesn't work the same. So like Darwin said, Darwin lamented the fact that we keep people like blacks, aboriginals, people of color alive with medical treatments, and in some extreme cases, the pinnacle of evolutionary progress, the beautiful, stunning white European man goes and has relations with one of the colored savages, as he likes to refer to people of color, and create these mixed offsprings that should be infertile, according to Broca and Haeckel. And like I said, I'm a biracial man and I'm not infertile. Um, so as a result of this interference, like basically keeping people of color alive, and we should just let them die, or better yet, just exterminate them altogether. The fittest do not always survive, according to Darwin's cousin Francis Galton. So what Francis Galton, Darwin's first cousin, did was he deliberately, consciously set out to improve the race. In fact, Francis Galton it was who coined the term eugenics to describe efforts at race betterment. You know, my father was black. My mother is from Central America, from Nicaragua. And um, when somebody expressed concern to my mother's aunt about her, you know, having children with a black man, um, my mother's aunt said, "Well, she's only bettering his race." You see, she thought she thought that, just like a lot of other people, that black people were just inferior, and so, you know, by them becoming less black and more like us, she's just bettering his. That's She actually said that. My mom told me the story many times over. Um, but the word eugenics comes from the Greek word meaning both, meaning good in birth or noble in heredity. In 1883, Galton defined eugenics as the science of improving stock, which is by no means confined to questions of judicious mating, but which takes cognizance of all influences that tend, in however remote a degree, to give the more suitable races, remember, preservation of the favored races, in other words, white Europeans, those are the more suitable races to them, or strains of blood, a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. So, in other words, we need to create a science called eugenics, of race betterment, in order to allow only the most desirable people to procreate. I know this probably sounds very uncomfortable and gross, because it is. It's incredibly disgusting and racist and sick, but this is what it is. Okay. So basically, instead of just allowing people to, you know, sort of evolve naturally, Francis Galton, he wanted to artificially and synthetically create a way to expedite evolutionary progress through this new science, aimed at race betterment, called eugenics. And this is facts. Fact check me. For those of you who don't like what I'm saying, fact check me. Um, Galton was particularly concerned with the decline of genius in society, because he believed that intelligence is an inherited trait and that the upper class contained the most intelligent and accomplished people. And he was therefore alarmed to discover that poor people had a higher birth rate. You know, those old poor colors just having lots of babies, that's a problem. So in 1904, Galton explained how eugenics might address this problem. So he says, eugenics is a science which deals with all influences that improve and develop the inborn qualities of races. But what is meant by improvement? We must leave listen to this. We must leave morals as far as possible out of the discussion, on account of the almost hopeless difficulties they raise as to whether a character as a whole is good or bad. So how can you leave morals out of the discussion? Well, when you remove God from the equation by replacing creation with natural selection, the Bible with books and the Bible with books like On the Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle of Life, you also remove God's morals from the equation as well. So things like thou shalt not kill, none of those things matter because those rather inconvenient divine morals are now out of the way, and you're free to better the race by any means necessary because the ends justify the means. Of course, if you need to exterminate people, kill people, whatever you need to do, sterilize people, not a big deal. So that's why Galton said, we must leave morals as far as possible out of the discussion. Like, yeah, we got to move that aside so we can just go and just start killing people so we can get to the height of evolutionary progress. I know it sounds crazy, right? But it's the truth. Francis Galton set out to enact policies and practices to deliberately and purposely, like essentially sculpt human society. And he named that new race betterment science or pseudoscience as eugenics. And in time, this eugenics came to be, whether you like to admit it or not, it came to be one of the most defining and most deadly ideas of the 20th century. Now, in the United States, eugenics was particularly attractive because, you see, the white ruling class had a bit of a problem on their hands. You see, all of these now free former Black slaves were starting to migrate north and were going to be allowed to kind of just live and do as they please in this country, well, for the most part, right? And that was a problem. So to combat the potential problem of undesirables like Negroes procreating freely, starting in 1907, eugenics laws. So you say, oh, eugenics is pseudoscience, nobody listens to it. No, there were actual laws that were passed around eugenics. And one of the first eugenics laws was in the state of Indiana, where it says Governor Hanley approved the first eugenics law on May 9th, 1907, which, listen to this, it made sterilization mandatory for criminals, idiots, rapists, and imbeciles in state custody. But this wasn't just Indiana. Eugenics laws were subsequently passed in 31 states. Wait, what? 31 states. Now, at this time, we didn't even have 50 states yet because Alaska and Hawaii hadn't even joined the union. We only had 48 states, I believe. Yeah, I think it was 48 states. So 31 out of 48 states, that means the vast majority, 2/3 of the United States passed eugenics laws. Okay. And what did this lead to? This led to, and this is a conservative estimate, these eugenics laws that were passed in 31 out of the 48 states led to an estimated 80,000 people being sterilized against their will by the government and by government eugenicists in the name of purification. I know it's tough, but it is what it is. Face it, that's the facts. In the Guardian, the London Guardian, I know you guys like that mainstream media stuff, so I'm going to bring that to you. It says, where science fiction meets the dark history of eugenics. It says, American eugenics was led by Charles Davenport. Now, who was Charles Davenport? Charles Davenport was a biologist, and he was a serious acolyte or devotee of Francis Galton. So follow me. Darwin, natural selection, very racist ideas, wants people of color to be exterminated. So the beautiful, stunning, perfect pinnacle of evolutionary progress, the white man can, take his place, and humanity can just be beautiful and white and bright and perfect. And all these colors can be eliminated because they're just basically slightly evolved monkeys, according to Darwin. And then here comes Ernst Haeckel and Paul Broca, who add some jet fuel to his theory. And then Francis Galton takes a hold of his theory and creates the pseudoscience of eugenics to codify ethnic cleansing and racial purifying. And then Charles Davenport, who was a serious devotee of Francis Galton, creates the Eugenics Records Office in Cold Springs Harbor, New York, which set out in 1910 to harvest the pedigrees of Americans. So they were going to go start looking at Americans, what they accomplished, what they were capable of. And with this data, what Davenport figured was that they could establish the inheritance of traits of both desirable and defective, and thus determine who was eligible to have children and who was not. So we think you're smart, but you're black, so no, you can't have children. Next, no, you can't have. That's basically what they were thinking, and thus purify the American people. In another article I have, it says, after the creation of the Eugenics Records Office in 1910, Charles Davenport, listen, see, because you think it's just some fringe crazies, but this is not fringe crazies. It says, Charles Davenport became the most influential and powerful eugenicist and propagandist for eugenics in the United States, directing the primary American organization for promoting eugenics education and popularization. Davenport was without peer or rival in the American eugenics movement. His close contact and cordial relations with many of the wealthiest philanthropists in the United States who had eugenics interest. Why? Because all these rich white people, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, you think all these people like love you, and that's why they have the Carnegie Foundation and they're philanthropists. No, these people want to kill us. Okay? And so his connection to all these people help him get the money to bankroll his crazy ideas. And it says, for Davenport, eugenics provided a practical approach to addressing societal problems. Quote, it is a reproach to our intelligence that we as people, proud in other respects of our control of nature, should have to support about 500,000 insane, feeble-minded, epileptic, blind, deaf, 80,000 prisoners, 100,000 paupers at a cost of over $100 million per year. So, in other words, these people are just useless eaters. Who said that? We'll go back to that. Heredity in relations to eugenics was widely used in the United States, and this was a book that was written by Davenport. It's called Heredity in Relations to Eugenics. It was widely used in the United States and abroad as a textbook for college and medical school courses in eugenics and health. Okay. Now, how did eugenics target Black people specifically? I know I've kind of hinted at it and been making wisecracks throughout, but I'm going to get specific. In the 1920s, many of the states authorized forced sterilization of thousands of undesirable people with disabilities, prisoners, racial minorities, on the theory that, as the U.S. Supreme Court put in upholding Virginia's forced sterilization law in 1927, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. American proponents of eugenics, which was a scientific movement to, quote unquote, improve the genetic composition of the human population, soon accelerated sterilization programs, which served as a model for Nazi programs implemented during the Holocaust. Did you hear that? We'll get back to that. Now, and how do they do that? They did this while Black people were forced to stay in the hospital. They did this by lying to Black women and telling them that they were giving them a vaccine, and instead they were sterilizing them. And you wonder why in the city of New York, only 27% of the Black people actually took that, that shot that they were talking about a few years ago so much. And they don't trust them people because there's a history. Anyway, whatever. We'll get back to that. American sterilization laws were also used as a tool of racialized population control. From the 1920s to 1970s, thousands of poor Southern Black women were sterilized without their knowledge or consent. Most states abandoned eugenics programs after World War II, but sterilization increased in Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, coinciding with growing Black political power, mandatory integration, and the civil rights movement. Some states continued to sterilize into the 1970s. I was born in the 1970s. That tells you how far this thing went on. I'm almost 50 years old. Let's get a little bit into Davenport a little bit more, that sick fool. So Charles Davenport, it says, it is important to appreciate that within the U.S. And European scientific communities, these ideas were not fringe. See, because today they say, oh, those were just crazies. And no, these were not fringe ideas. They were widely held, and they were taught in universities, like reputable universities. Eugenics and all the craziness by Davenport. Like I said, his book, Heredity in Relation to Eugenics, was widely used in the United States as a textbook for college and medical school courses on eugenics and health. So, you know, this is not some fringe idea. Says the report of the eugenics meeting was the lead story in the journal Science of Science on October 7th, 1921, and this opening address was published in its entirety beginning on the first page of issue 3. To understand why eugenics became a serious scientific movement in the 1920s, it's useful to go back 20 years earlier. In 1902, Charles B. Davenport, then a professor of zoology at the University of Chicago, approached the Carnegie Institution. Again, remember those Carnegies and Rockefellers and all those rich people, those rich elites, with a request for $45,000 to create a biological experiment station for the study of evolution on the Cold Springs Harbor campus. His aim would be the analytic experimentation of the causes of specific differentiation of race changes. He proposed to accomplish this by crossbreeding animals and plants to find laws of commingling and qualities, and then translate that into his understanding of humanity, right? It says here that it took until 1910 for Davenport to begin studies on human inheritance and the creation of the Eugenics Records Office. Financial support came from the Harrimans, John Harvey Kellogg, some of you Adventists might know who that is, and the American Breeders Association. And it says by the 1920s, 3 major efforts pushed the eugenics agenda in the United States and subsequently throughout Europe. 1, the Eugenics Research Association with Laughlin and Davenport as leaders, and in affiliation with the American Association of the Advancement of Science. Number 2, the American Eugenics Society, founded by Laughlin, Harry Crampton, Madison Grant, and Henry Fairfield Osborne, with the purpose of promoting the eugenical movement at both scientific and popular levels. And 3, the Eugenics Records Office, directed by Davenport and run by Laughlin, with the express purpose of providing the scientific data to support the eugenics movement. In other words, to justify why they were going to sterilize all these blacks and, you know, people of color. So that then leads us to what eventually happened was that as a result of all these sterilizations, many people were not allowed to have children and procreate and things like that. It was the hopes of the American Eugenics Society. Their goal was that in time they would be able to sterilize 1/10 of the U.S. population, or millions of Americans. I mean, today that would be like maybe 40 million Americans, right? Now that brings us to Margaret Sanger. Some of you may have heard that name, and we're getting close to being done. But Margaret Sanger is the founder and longtime leader of Planned Parenthood, and she was a straight up racist. The evidence for her racism is overwhelming, and to deny that you have to be crazy or you have to have your head in the sand. Sanger was, they make it seem like she was an advocate for birth control and what she did was so good for society and all her goals and desires were all altruistic and stuff like that. But in fact, she wasn't necessarily an advocate for birth control per se. She didn't necessarily want everybody to have birth control. She just wanted birth control of the people she considered unwanted people in society and groups that she determined to be undesirable or human weeds, like, like Black people. Sanger's goal was to create a race of thoroughbreds. Like, you ever heard that term, the master race or the Uberman, right? That's what the Germans said. Thank you so much. Thank you. And that term, that race of thoroughbreds, the master race, the Uberman, was a term evocative of the goals of Nazis. She drew this sharp line, not so much between black and white as fit and unfit, but by fit she meant whites, not just whites, but only educated upper class whites. By unfit she meant pretty much everyone else, right? And then in an article that I have here, it says, in 1926, Sanger spoke to the women's chapter of the Ku Klux Klan in New Jersey about her ideas for reducing the Black birth rate. The racists loved it, and other speaking invitations followed, as you might imagine. Sanger also created what she called, oh, look at this. This one's fun. She created what she called the Negro Project at Planned Parenthood. And it was designed, in her words, to get rid of, human beings that should have never been born. And what she did was she recruited these Judas goats, Black pastors and activists, and paid them to convince Black people to reduce their birth rates by sterilization if necessary. You ever heard of W.E. Du Bois? Yeah. Anyway, we won't get into that too much. In one of her letters, Sanger said, "We do not want word to get out that we are trying to exterminate the Negro population." The Nazis based their racist sterilization laws on American models developed by Sanger and Davenport and others. Sanger herself praised the Nazi laws as more advanced than anything passed in the United States. And what is her legacy? What is the legacy of Margaret Sanger and her Negro Project and her efforts to reduce the Black birth rate? Well, this is from Newsweek. It says, Black women are nearly 4 times as likely to have an abortion as their white counterparts. Recent studies have found that for every 100 live births, nearly 12 white babies will be aborted, while nearly 43 Black babies will die by abortion for every 100 live births. Did you hear that? That's a problem. That's a big problem. Another article that I have says, is there something wrong with this picture? Nearly 40% of all abortions in America since Roe v. Wade have been from Black Americans. This equates to more than 20 million Black babies aborted. And not only do you kill those children, but their children and their children's children and their children's children's children. So these are millions of people. See, the human race grows exponentially, you see? And these are millions of people that didn't exist. So this population that we have of, however many Black people in this country, 46 million Black people, might be 150 million or more if it wasn't for this purposeful, deliberate effort to exterminate Black people or at least control the population. Here it says that 20 million aborted babies since Roe v. Wade, Black babies, that'd be the equivalent of the populations of New York and Florida. Yet Black people make up just 14% of the U.S., while white people account for 35% of all abortions as the majority of the population. So only 14% of the U.S. and 40% of all abortions are Black people. Is it because Black people suffer more cases of incest and rape, or mothers need to abort due to threat of death? Probably not. So why is this happening? Some people think it's a silent genocide. Um, after all abortions, after all the abortions amount to about 50% reduction of the Black population. So imagine double the amount of Black people. Okay. Then there's something called the Margaret Sanger Award. The Margaret Sanger, that racist, sick demon, created the Margaret Sanger Award, which is Planned Parenthood's highest honor. It is presented annually to someone who demonstrates leadership, excellence, and outstanding contributions to reproductive health and rights movements, or is it to people who carry forth their agenda? One has to wonder. But the award was established 40 something years ago in 1966. Oh, man, 50, maybe it's 50 something. Anyway, it was established in 1966, and it was awarded in that year to Dr. Carl G. Hartman, to General William H. Draper Jr., to President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was a horrible racist, who hated Black people, used the N-word liberally, and famously said when passing the Civil Rights Act that he would have those N-words voting Democrat for the next 200 years. And the fourth recipient of the first Margaret Sanger Award was none other than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'm going to leave that right there. Anyway, other recipients of the Sanger Award include wonderful people like House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who famously said about young Black men in 1996, we need to take these people on. They are often connected to big drug cartels. They're not just a gang of kids anymore. They're often the kind of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel like they were dogs. No wonder she received the award. But who was the biggest fan? And this, I'll end with this. I know I'm probably running a little long. Who was the biggest fan of the American eugenics movement? Well, Germany. Germany had, in this article in The Guardian, it says, Germany had recently developed its own body of eugenics knowledge and library of publications. Yet German readers still closely followed the American eugenics accomplishments as the model. Biological courts, forced sterilizations, detention for the socially inadequate, debates on euthanasia, as America's elite were describing the socially worthless and ancestrally unfit as bacteria, vermin, mongrels, and subhuman. A superior race of Nordics were increasingly seen as the answer to the globe's eugenics problems. U.S. laws, eugenics investigations, and ideology became blueprints for Germany's rising tide of race biologists and race-based hate mongers. One such agitator was a disgruntled corporal in the German army. In 1924, he was serving time in prison for mob action. While there, he spent some time poring over eugenics textbooks, and which extensively quoted Davenport. Popeny and other American eugenical stalwarts. He closely followed the writings of Leon Whitney, who was the president of the American Eugenics Society, and Madison Grant, who extolled the Nordic race and bemoaned its corruption by the Jews, Negroes, Slavs, and others who did not possess the beautiful blonde hair and blue eyes. And this young German corporal that we're talking about, that was such a fan of all these sick American eugenicists, even wrote one of them fan mail. Okay, so this German corporal that was a huge fan of Davenport, Leon Whitney, Madison Grant, and all these people, even wrote one of them a fan mail. It says, in the passing of the great race, Grant wrote, Mistaken regard for what are believed to be divine laws and the sentimental belief in the sanctity of human life tend to prevent both the elimination of defective infants and sterilization of such adults as are themselves of no value to the community. The laws and nature require the obliteration of the unfit, and human life is valuable only when it is of use to the community or race. One day in the 1930s, Leon Whitney visited Madison Grant to show off a letter he had just received from Germany, written by this corporal who was now out of prison and rising on the German political scene. Grant could only smile. He pulled out his letter that he had. It was from the same German thanking Grant for writing The Passing of the Great Race. The fan letter called Grant's book his Bible. The man who sent those letters was Adolf Hitler. So what we have here is we have Darwin creates natural selection. Dr. Paul Broca and the German doc scientist Ernst Haeckel add jet fuel to this natural selection by creating the physical anthropology and scientific racism of the 19th century. You have Darwin's first cousin, Francis Galton, who created the idea of eugenics or race betterment or race purification. Then you have Davenport, who was a acolyte and huge fan of Galton, who then created all of these, he hooked up with all these rich people to create all of these organizations and codify ethnic cleansing in 31 states out of the 48. Okay. And then they created the American Eugenics Society and people like Margaret Sanger, who actively sought to exterminate Black people. And these people in turn inspired a man by the name of Adolf Hitler. And we know how the rest of the story goes. By their fruits, ye shall know them. If you don't like it, you little evolutionists, I don't care. The facts are the facts, and the truth is the truth. Don't argue with emotion, argue with truth. Because if you sit there and you look at the truth, you're going to have to face the fact that evolution is sick and has led to the destruction of tens of millions of people in this world. It is one of the most destructive and dangerous ideas of the 20th century. It is sick, and all the racism that we deal with till this day is a direct result of that sick theory. I hope you all enjoyed that. I'll be back soon with another topic, and we'll go into this maybe a little further. See you guys.